Hey guys, Scott here from phasingplayer.com, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of High Frontier today. Go through all the games that led to High Frontier for All. It starts with Rocket Flight, which is a very old design of Phil Eklund's, started in the 70s, the first edition that is impossible to find. It stems from the Lords series, seen here as Lords of the Sierra Madre or Lords of the Renaissance. So this game came in a Ziploc bag originally. It was sort of just this package, components you had to cut out yourself, nothing die cut, and it retailed for $16, which is a pretty good price, I think. It's a little more expensive today on the aftermarket. This is the second edition of the game. Like I said, the first edition is a bit more difficult to find. I believe there were only maybe a dozen ever made, and I'm not sure that anyone will ever find one if they still exist. Something that this game has that High Frontier, any edition of High Frontier lacks, is Spacewood. You can buy Spacewood in this game, and that's something that did not carry over to future releases. It also uses a hex map to move around. Each spacecraft actually has two tokens, two little cardboard chits that represent where it was and where it's going. The galaxy, the solar system, I should say, the inner solar system, is represented here. There's Earth and there's Venus, and any of these shaded spots, like Jupiter down here, any of these are actually expanded out further with a tactical map. And this is the tactical map here for a few of the locations for Earth, Mars, Mercury. You can see them marked here. So when you go to those locations, you actually switch to this map, which is a bit more zoomed in. So the Jupiter map is a larger map because it also covers the moons of Jupiter. So there's Jupiter kind of in the middle over here, and then you have the moons down here. It's kind of an interesting system. Now the rocket parts are these different sized little chits that you cut out from a sheet. They come in a handful of different colors. Rocket Flight also starts the long-running High Frontier tradition of putting a bunch of science into the rulebook to explain all of the technology you'll find, which is pretty cool. It's got these combat charts, too. The different spacecrafts can battle each other, and players can shoot each other down. Now, as far as players go, the game supports up to 6. They each have their own unique abilities, and they do different things in the game. These are the rocket planning sheets where you put your rocket parts and measure weight and all that kind of stuff. Stuff that'll be carried over into High Frontier going forward. The game has cards as well, which players bid on. Now this is a similar system to the other Lords games, where a card will get flipped up at the start of every turn, and then players can auction it off and collect it to improve their own sort of situation. There are a lot of cards here. I'm sure you won't see most of them in a given game. And here's the currency of Rocket Flight. The game demands that you bring a whole bunch of these into the game for use as water, which is going to be your currency and your propellant. It says here at 100 or 200 pennies, so I hope you have those sitting around. So it took about 15 years until Phil put out a new edition of Rocket Flight, now just straight up called High Frontier. The first edition here came in a pretty small box. When I got it in my hands originally, I was surprised at how tiny it was. It says on the back that it is the most realistic simulation of rocket travel ever made. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it is a pretty good simulation. And here's everything you get. Honestly, not that much comes in the original High Frontier. You have your 5 player pieces in different colors. You got a bag of Tiddlywinks, which is a Sierra Madre game staple. You have these crew cards, which actually got cut out of this sheet with a pair of scissors. And that sheet is what you put the thruster, robonaut, and refinery decks onto, as well as tracking points. You have a fuel strip sheet for each player, which are vertically oriented, as you'll see changes later. A manual, and of course the map. Now, High Frontier managed to filter all the copper out of the water from Rocket Flight and gives you these clear Tiddlywinks instead of the pennies that you had to supply yourself before. Like I said, the crew cards were cut out from another sheet, And they're just these kind of slightly different sized, one-sided cards with a Rescue Pod rad hardness value that is never found in High Frontier again. And here's the map. Now, if you've seen the High Frontier map of any edition, this probably looks very familiar. Phil figured out what he wanted from this map pretty early, and I think he nailed it. This one extends to the Jupiter zone, but you can't actually go to Jupiter at first. There's some Space Ventures points available listed on the map, as well as a little legend and player aid on the top right. Now, released alongside High Frontier back in 2010 was the High Frontier expansion, which included an extended map. I think it got said somewhere that it wasn't anticipated that players would make it this far out. But it extends out to actual Jupiter instead of just the Jupiter zone, and goes all the way out to Saturn too. It also gives you 3 spots for 3 new types of cards. These are support cards that could be optionally used in a more advanced game. And these would be seen in every version of High Frontier going forward. So having kind of more advanced rockets was definitely part of the game from the get-go. So whether you used them or not was an option. The expansion also includes a political system, as well as a turn tracker that is not present in the core game. Now, I've said for a while that the map in High Frontier is a litmus test on if you're going to enjoy it or not. You look at the map and you're either going to run away scared or be interested in the game, and that carries through in the first edition. First edition also includes these triangle burns that are tied to events that are only present in the first and second edition. Now in 2013, High Frontier Colonization came out, which is a new expansion. It contains everything from the first expansion, all the cards, but it also adds new bits, new rules, new systems, and is a much more comprehensive expansion. And honestly, I think without it, High Frontier would be maybe a pretty good game, but this really completes the package. Now, the map extension in Colonization goes out even further than the extension from the original release. It goes all the way out to the Pluto and Neptune zones, and to reach them, it includes some new optional rocket types that you can use to travel a little more efficiently. So it all really comes together quite nicely if you play with all of the rules. Colonization also expands on the political system from the first expansion, and makes the Sol cycle a little more robust. Point values for making factories is also increased in the Colonization expansion, and it adds a new spectral type, D, which is present on the previous map but is a wild card. There are some new types of cards as well introduced, Gigawatt Thrusters, Freighters, Burnells, and Colonists, which would also be in the 3rd edition of the game and 4th edition. Regardless of which expansion you are using, Colonization or the expansion, it all comfortably fits into that tiny, tiny High Frontier box, which is cool. I'm always worried when I get expansions for games that they are not going to pack up into the original box, but even with the small box size for High Frontier, it all fits actually very comfortably, which I appreciate. Now, a few years later, Phil would license High Frontier to One Small Step, who would go on to do a Kickstarter for High Frontier 3rd edition. Now, while the copyright here says 2015, the game didn't actually come out till 2017, after a somewhat tumultuous Kickstarter campaign. But it is a pretty comprehensive release. It includes a gorgeous map, everything from the Colonization expansion and High Frontier 1 or 2. It's really set up as a sort of collecting all of the existing High Frontier materials and throwing it into one box. And for the most part, I think they succeeded. They got rid of those triangle burns I mentioned earlier and added a new type of burn called lander burns. Some of the rules were tweaked as far as how you land on sites, and these were a consequence of that. They also included in this game a giant version of the map, as you can see here. It's quite a bit bigger, and you can struggle to fit it on most tables, but in all honesty, this is the way I usually play the game. I have a table big enough, thankfully, that'll fit everything, and the 2 map boards you put together actually line up pretty well. So when I am playing at home, I always bust out this giant version. The fuel strip also got a bit of a makeover, now horizontally oriented instead of vertically. And they updated the water too. Instead of being clear tiddlywinks, they were slightly thicker blue beads, though they did include an option for Tiddlywinks if you wanted that. I don't know why it has both in here, but they can be useful and you can go with your preference. The cards are largely the same as the earlier edition, still double-sided, and they just tweaked a little bit of the details, added a few extras as well, but they did make over the crew cards, now being actual regular-sized cards instead of these things you had to cut out that were almost square-shaped. They also added new factions on the back of each one, so you had a few more options available to you. They also expanded the glory system found in High Frontier into their own discrete cards. And they also took those ventures that were printed on the map earlier and put them onto their own cards to clear the board up a little bit. They also included the solitaire game Interstellar, which uses some of the components from High Frontier. Originally, this was something you could buy on Zazzle as like a poster, and you would take components from High Frontier and play this game with it. It's a neat thing, and it's a nice inclusion for a comprehensive package. The rocket designs and pieces were also upgraded a bit. This is a rocket, Burnell, and outpost marker, and the game included 4 full-color manuals. And then today, we have High Frontier for All, releasing in 2020, 3 years after the 3rd edition arrived to backers. It is a box of a similar size to 3rd edition, though a little bit smaller, actually. The 3rd edition box is super large, mostly to accommodate that extra map. It comes with 5 manuals, 2 of which are actually for introductory games. This version is certainly trying to get new players into the game, and I think that's great. I think for the most part, these 2 rule sets work well. They include their own discrete components, unlike the 2nd and 3rd edition, which has the cards playing double duty. 4th edition breaks out each introductory game into its own set of pieces. As you can see here from the Race for Glory cards on the right side versus the regular game on the left. It is nice to have discrete cards for each version of the game you're going to be playing. And then the crew cards were also expanded a bit. Before, with the 3rd edition, the reverse sides were just swapped around powers, where in 4th edition, there are 12 unique crews, which is really cool. Also, the support cards from the previous editions, which were optional, are now mandatory parts of this game, so they integrate a bit better. And the glory system is also upgraded in 4th edition, taking the cards and turning them into little chits that you place around the board. The map is also, I think, the best that the map has looked. The colors are tweaked a bit, and there's a new spectral type added, and the fuel strip is also modular now, a total redesign of it visually with some mechanical tweaks, and modularity for current and future expansions. It also added miniatures, because what board game in 2020 doesn't have miniatures? So why don't we do some direct comparisons here? Here are the fuel strips, with the left one being 1st edition, the top one being 3rd edition, and the bottom one being the 4th edition. And here's some water beads from Rocket Flight, 1st edition, 3rd edition, and 4th edition. And a NASA card from each edition as well. You can see these sort of weird size from the 1st edition cutout here. And the same Photon Kite Sail from 1st, 3rd, and 4th. As well as the reverse black side of the card. You can see minor tweaks made to numbers too. And the rockets from each one, 1st edition, 3rd edition, 4th edition. And that's it. Those are the major editions of High Frontier. I don't have the 2nd edition here, but it is largely unchanged from 1st edition. So hopefully you guys enjoyed seeing each one, and I'll see you on the next video.